friend, it's a great privilege for me to join others in paying tribute to the memory of J.R.D. Tata by discussing a topic that would have, I believe, interested him. J.R.D. was a great man of action, and he had an extraordinary gift in converting his strong convictions into practical action. His evaluations, extensive and complicated as they were, given his multiple concerns and interests, were followed up by determined action through his well-reasoned as well as firm agency. And he was unusually successful in constructing what he wanted to create. As it happens, on the subject of gender-sensitive ethics, both the evaluative aspect and the agency aspect have their own importance. And we have to see them together, because they're interlinked, even as we distinguish between their respective roles. When in my youth I began getting interested in statistics, I remember being struck by some of the oddities of social statistics. One particular curiosity that I found striking was what was called, quote-unquote, net female reproduction rate, which roughly put is the number of daughters produced per woman. It was taken to be, with good reason, a useful way of looking at the growth rate of total population. I was particularly struck by the fact that there did not seem to be any interest in this statistics on the existence of men. It's easy to understand why, in explaining population growth, men are not in the foreground. But the vision of population dynamics without bringing in men at all did nevertheless seem strange to me at that time. I remember asking a classmate of mine, this was at Presidential College in Calcutta, where I was then studying, whether she found it at all striking that this was the case. Not at all, she told me. Why should men get into the story? They're not really needed, she added firmly, except very occasionally. Well, that is indeed so, and there's no symmetry between women and men, between women and other people, as I have taken the liberty of calling, in reproduction. But that question leads to another. Does this asymmetry have a kind of opposite impact on spheres of life other than reproduction? There's no necessary reason at all why this should be the case, since reproduction can be combined with all other activities if the world is well organized to promote and support gender symmetry. And yet, in the way the world has been organized over centuries, it is hard to think that the special role of women in reproduction and in the rearing of children would not impact on their freedom to do other things until society starts to make positive arrangements consciously for gender equity. When many years later I got very involved in studying the roots of gender inequality, it was difficult not to give some kind of an ancestral role to this biological difference in the analysis of what I called, quote-unquote, cooperative conflict. Cooperative conflict, because both the words are important, as I would explain. My main paper on this was called Gender and Cooperative Conflict. It was published in 1990 in a volume edited by Irene Tinker called Persistent Inequalities. To understand the process, we can start by noting the fact that women and men have both congruent and conflicting interests affecting family living. Because of the extensive areas of congruence of interest, decision-making in the family tends to take the form of the pursuit of cooperation, with some agreed solution, usually implicit, of the conflicting aspects. Each of the parties has much to lose if cooperation were to break down, and yet there are various alternative, what are called cooperative solutions, each of which may be better for both the parties than to no cooperation at all, but which respectively give different, possibly extremely divergent, relative gains to the two parties involved. The mathematical nature of this type of relationship, with partial congruence of interest along with substantial conflict, has been outlined by the great game theorist John Nash, who now is been known in academic circles for a long time, but it now became very famous when my friend Sylvia Nasser did the book on The Beautiful Mind, and then even more when that became a film. This paper, they are called The Bargaining Problem, though in that Nash did not go into family arrangement at all, in fact didn't discuss it at all, is in fact a classic paper, I believe, for family economics too. And this was, because it was such a general paper in game theory, this was among the papers, indeed the first one, to be cited by the Royal Swedish Academy in awarding John Nash the Nobel Prize in Economics. The nature of the problem is very general and arises also in many other real-life contexts. As I mentioned, Nash had no particular interest at that time in family economics. And examples can be given from bargaining in trade, in negotiation, in labor relations, in political treaties between different countries, and even in understanding the nature of the gains and losses from contemporary globalization. For example, those who are not particularly concerned about the intensification of inter-country and inter-group inequalities which has accompanied globalization often point to the fact, which is not invariably true but correct enough often, that all the countries can gain from globalization. That may be the case, and those who want globalization to be combined with conscious attention being paid to the issues of inequality tend to be undermined by this point of that everyone gains, so what the hell are you complaining about? But the answer is the Nash question. The fact that they're all gaining doesn't mean that they're gaining in a fair way. Some people may be gaining tremendously and others not. I'm a great believer in globalization, but I'm also a believer in doing things about it so that the distribution of benefits and penalties are much more fair than they are actually in the world. It's the general combined approach that some of us have tried to pursue. So, and in that context, Nash becomes very central. It's not the case that people are not gaining. You know, there are some cases where globalization did hurt one or two countries, some countries, but some may be gaining very little, and others may be getting a very vast amount indeed. Nash's formulation, the related ones, and I have to say I too have tried my hand in developing different ways of thinking and different kinds of models with bargaining problems and cooperative conflict, help inter alia to provide a basic understanding of what is involved in assessing the fairness of family divisions, of chores and benefits. The simultaneous presence of cooperation and conflict is indeed a major feature of family arrangements which demand both predictive and normative scrutiny, even though, as I've discussed elsewhere, the ethics and the politics of the problem have to be seen somewhat differently and rather in different lines from the way Nash himself characterized in his pioneering paper in 1951, which opened up the subject for all of us to follow him and then try to move away from some of his modeling. Exactly how does the problem of interactive relations involve both cooperation and conflict. Both the parties have strong interest in having some cooperative solution rather than none, and yet they rank the different cooperative solutions in quite dissimilar ways, indeed often in exactly opposite directions, depending on who gets how much from, say, cooperative living in a family. There is a simultaneous presence of cooperation as well as conflict in relationship of this kind. And since the conflicts are well hidden in the needed, and it is needed, harmonious culture of family living, we have to pay special attention to the far-reaching implications of inequalities generated by the equilibrium that one culture or another tends to produce and sustain in family relations. Indeed, family arrangements are quintessential examples of such cooperative conflict. The advantage of women in being able to conceive and produce children, which make them so central in population dynamics, as I discussed earlier, can, on the other side, make them more dependent on the harmony of the family and less demanding of a fair share of the family's joint benefits. The choice of one cooperative arrangement from the set of many alternative possibilities leads to a particular distribution of jointly produced benefits. Some of these divisions are particularly unfavorable to women, and if cooperation is arranged through such a division, it can yield tremendous gender inequality. The structure of cooperative conflict is a general feature, as I said, of many group relations, and a better understanding of the nature and effects of cooperative conflicts can help to identify the influences that operate on, quote-unquote, the deal that women get in family divisions. Conflict between partially disparate interests within family living are typically resolved through implicitly agreed, and I emphasize implicitly, agreed patterns of behavior that may or may not be particularly egalitarian. The special nature of family living, leading joint lives, and sharing a home requires that the elements of conflict must not be explicitly emphasized. Indeed, dwelling on conflicts in family relations rather than the family's unity tends to be seen as totally aberrant behavior. Sometimes the deprived women may not only be silent, she may not even have a clear assessment of the extent of her relative deprivation. The perception of who is doing how much, quote-unquote, productive work and who is, quote-unquote, contributing how much to the family's prosperity can be, in this context, very influential, even though the underlying theory regarding how contributions and productivity are to be assessed may be rarely discussed explicitly, and indeed they're very difficult to discuss, because if you're being productive in, say, industrial work, and you're not doing any homework, you cannot sustain that life without the homework. And yet the homework would not get any of the attributions of the higher productivity that's happening outside the family. The interpretation of individual contributions and appropriate entitlement of women and men play a major role in the diverse families' in the division of families' joint benefits between men and women. As a result, the circumstances that influence these perceptions of contributions and appropriate entitlement, such as women's ability to earn an independent income, to work outside the home, to be educated, to own property, can have a crucial bearing on these divisions. The impact of greater empowerment and independent agency of women thus includes the correction of the iniquities that blights the lives and the well-being of women vis-à-vis men. There have been a number of studies connected with it. I think I see David K. Jain, and there was a book that she edited and to which I contributed, namely The Tyranny of the Family, goes into some of the issues. So does Bina Agarwal's thing about a field of your own, which discusses how the ownership inequality of land ownership could make a major difference to the way the benefits come to women and men in a family. Similarly, the impact of female education in challenging widespread gender inequality has been shown to be, across the world, to be quite large, and is reflected also in interstate and interdistrict comparisons within this country. If the analysis here is right, then the evaluative assessment and critique of various ongoing social and institutional arrangements have to be translated into actions and agencies. We have to go more into the policy implications of the recent empirical works that show that women's harder lives and more restrained well-being is strongly influenced by such variables as women's ability to earn an independent income, as I mentioned earlier, to find employment outside the home, to have ownership rights, especially over land, to have literacy and be educated participants in decisions within and outside the family. In fact, strikingly, the survival disadvantage of women compared with men in developing countries seem to go down sharply and may even get eliminated at the mortality asymmetry level as progress is made in these agency aspects, or at least that is the hope. The difference between such distinct advantages as women's earning power, economic role of the family, literacy and education, property rights and so on, may at first sight appear to be quite disparate and not linked with each other. It looks like not one theory but a collection of theories. But they are not. What they all have in common, however, is the positive contribution of each in adding force to women's agency, to making women more independent and more empowered, having a stronger voice and a stronger claim that they can actually voice. For example, empirical investigations have brought out the way women's work outside the home and earning an independent income tend to have a powerful impact on the enhancement of women's standing and voice in decision-making within the household and more broadly in the society in a variety of fields. The contribution of female members of the family to its prosperity, which is often ignored, women's work, typically very hard, inside the home, becomes much more difficult to neglect when women work outside the home. Women tend, as a result, to have more quote-unquote say, both because of enhanced standing and also because of reduced financial dependence on men. Further, outside employment often has useful educational effects in terms of exposure to the world outside the household, making her agency better informed and more effective. This makes it particularly important to see the role of both social institutions, which allow women to work outside despite having small children, and of social values, which find women's work outside the home socially acceptable. And it's this duality of institution values to which I would like to pay particular attention in the rest of this talk. There's an interactive connection here between women's education and women's employment, and in particular women's literacy and schooling, which make it easier for women to find work and also find suitable work that are combinable with whatever challenges, biological differences of being a woman poses. Similarly, female education strengthens women's agency and also tends to make this agency better informed and functionally more powerful. The ownership of property can also add to the influence and power of women in decisions within the family and beyond. The diverse variables that enhance women's social capability and effectiveness thus have empowering roles, both individually and jointly. Their combined operation has to be related to the understanding that women's power, economic independence, as well as social emancipation can have far-reaching effects on the forces and organizing principles that govern divisions within the family, the cooperative conflict solution, and can in particular influence what are implicitly accepted as women's entitlement. We have to recognize the complexity here arises from the fact that you cannot explicitly discuss conflicts within the family at all. So this has to be done all in the background, not as bargaining problem in the way Nash was presenting it, like workers versus employers, one country versus another, not like that at all. From the crude barbarity of physical violence against women to the complex instrumentality of health neglect, the deprivation of women is ultimately linked not only to the lower status of women, but also to the fact that women often lack the power to influence the behavior of other members of the society and the operation of social institutions and the understanding of the nature of the problem they're facing. And as I mentioned, sometimes women themselves don't see the facts of the deprivation and its causal antecedents with sufficient clarity. Many of the differences that plague the possibility of equity for women are not biological at all, but social. But while that is an important point to note, it's also important to pay attention to those problems, including the bearing of children and some asymmetries in child care, particularly in the neonatal feeding phase. It's therefore important not only to develop institutional arrangements for sharing the responsibilities in child care, but also to allow social developments that accommodate those asymmetries that would continue to exist between women and men for biological reasons. I want now to turn to a somewhat different focus in studying the impact of women's agency going beyond the well-being and freedom of women themselves. Other lives, men's and children's, are also involved. So the consequences of gender asymmetry beyond the domain of gender inequality in all its forms has to be considered. To begin with a simple example, it's particularly important to see the role of women's agency in, one, reducing child mortality, and two, restraining fertility. Both relate to concerns that are central to the process of development, and while they clearly do influence the well-being of women as well, their relevance is undoubtedly very much wider than that. The adverse effects of very high births include the denial of women's freedom to do other things other than bearing and rearing of the children. These burdens which are routinely imposed on many women, particularly in Asia and parts of Africa. It's thus not surprising that reductions in birth rates have often followed the enhancement of women's status and power. The lives that are most constrained by over-frequent bearing and rearing of children are those of young women. And any social change that increases the voice, not women in general, but particularly young women in general, and had a tremendous impact on fertility decision. And it wasn't surprising when, I think I see Jean Drèze there, when Jean Drèze, along with Mamata Murthy and Catherine Guyot, making comparisons within the districts of India, found these to be the two biggest factors influencing fertility differences, namely women's literacy and education on one side, and women's gainful employment, recognizable gainful employment on the other, compared with many other things that have been done. Certainly, compulsion and coercion is very ineffective, aside from being brutal, and certainly also the theories, particularly of Gary Becker, a close friend of mine, that it's income rise that reduces fertility is actually busted pretty much, because income turns out to be statistically what can be called orthogonal, no impact at all on fertility in these inter-district comparisons. The transforming power of women's schooling does seem to extend far beyond those simple demographic connections. Let me now illustrate this issue by considering the case of Bangladesh over recent years. Bangladesh is not often recognized, has come a long way in the last 4 decades since it was described unfair, even at that time, as being beyond redemption. In the first half of the 1970s, the country endured the most lethal cyclone ever recorded, estimated to have killed up to 500,000 people in 1970, a full-fledged war, eventually leading to country's independence, fight for and success in independence in 1971, and a large-scale famine in 1974, when the mortality wasn't all that high, because up to 6% of the population were actually being regularly fed in the langar khanas in Bangladesh. It's a successful case of famine relief. There were some deaths, but far less than what you would expect. Few observers at that time expected Bangladesh to make rapid social progress in the next few decades. In fact, the famine of 74 appeared to vindicate the prophets of doom, such as Paul Ehrlich, who had dismissed Bangladesh, East Pakistan at that time, in the population, his book called The Population Bomb, as a quote-unquote basket case country. Basket case is a well-known American word, not very known in India. And I'm glad it's not very known. It's a nasty word. It's some chap who is in a basket because he not only have no power, but his hands are gone, his legs are gone. He's sitting in a basket. You have to feed him or her. And so that was the understanding of Bangladesh. Today, Bangladesh is still one of the poorest countries in the world. There's no denying in that. And as in much of South Asia, large sections of the population continue to lack many of the bare essentials of good living. And yet, Bangladesh has made rapid progress in some of these crucial fields, particularly in the last 20 years, overtaking India in terms of most of the social indicators, in spite of India's much faster economic growth. And indeed, India has good reasons to take close interest in the experience of Bangladesh. There are some particular features of the Bangladesh experience that are of much relevance in India. Bangladesh is not a model of development by any means. Enormous amount to learn from there. In spite of much recent progress, Bangladesh remains one of the poorest and most deprivation-ridden countries in the world. And many of the policy biases discussed in our projected book with reference to India apply to Bangladesh as well. And with per capita GDP half as high as Bangladesh, half as high in Bangladesh as in India, the advantage of India was much smaller, but with India's higher growth rate is now twice the per capita income of Bangladesh. Public expenditure in Bangladesh is a mere 10% or so of the GDP in Bangladesh. About half as much as in India. The public services in Bangladesh are inevitably restrained, and whatever is already in place suffers from serious accountability problems, much as in India. Democratic institutions in Bangladesh are also in some trouble with the tradition by which opposition parties do not seem to attend parliament. And yet there are some features of astonishing achievement of Bangladesh that cannot but excite interest, curiosity, and engagement. The roots of Bangladesh's social development are not entirely transparent and deserve much greater scrutiny. However, some important likely clues are immediately worth noting. The first clue is a pattern of sustained positive change in gender relations, reflected, for instance, in school attendance of girls and workforce participation rates of adult women. If that indicates greater appreciation and creativity of women, the pro-women's perspective is also reflected in gender-specific mortality rates, which are actually is a much more strikingly better picture in Bangladesh than in India. As I said, many of the gender-related indicators now look much better in Bangladesh than in India. For instance, the women's workforce participation rate is almost twice as high in Bangladesh, 59 as in India, 59% in Bangladesh, 33% in India, based on comparable international definitions. This, along with gender, female literacy, and education, is recognized across the world as a powerful contributor to women's empowerment, and there's no reason why we wouldn't have expected that to work in Bangladesh's case too. In the field of elementary education, Bangladesh has made remarkable strides towards gender equality, so much so that school participation rates and literacy rates of Bangladeshi girls are higher than those of boys, in contrast with India, where substantial gender bias against girls persists. Indeed, Bangladesh seems to have the distinction of being the only country in the entire world in which the number of girls exceed the number of boys in school. Even the share of women in parliament, part of it of course is reserved, while much below one-half in both countries, is higher in Bangladesh than in India. To what extent do women's agency and gender relations account for the fact that Bangladesh has caught up with and even overtaken India in many crucial fields during the last 20 years calls for further investigation? But it certainly looked like an important clue in the light of what we know about the role of women's agency in development from data across the world. For instance, the fact that both female literacy and women's workforce participation play an important role in demographic transition from high to low mortality and fertility rates is fairly well established. And you could see, if you're ready to accept that connection, an example in Bangladesh. The subjugation of women in South Asia has also been plausibly invoked as a major explanation for the South Asian enigma. The fact that child undernutrition rates are higher in South Asia than in many countries that are much poorer is often cited. It is thus entirely plausible that Bangladesh's recent progress has been significantly driven by positive change in gender relations, by the new role of women in the Bangladeshi society. All the more remarkable because Bangladesh is a country with a vast Muslim majority, a characteristic that is often associated, at least in popular imagination, with neglecting women's interests. And since if you go, I won't go into bit by bit the table of comparison, but it's striking, health, everything. Just to give an example, even in delivery, 66% of Indian kids are immunized, 96% are in Bangladesh. And in all of these activities, women are tremendously powerful participants. On the basis of the empirical picture, I'm really now cutting this discussion because the paper is, the lecture is getting longer than I intended to, but it's not finished, I'm afraid. I can't give you the good news. That it looks as if that we can conclude that Bangladesh would have been a very different country and far less successful, but for the positive role of Bangladeshi women. Even though the impact of women's agency is clearly very far-reaching, there is a need to understand how the reach of agency, that agency is also qualified and sometimes restrained by the limits of information and knowledge, and also ultimately by the courage and temerity to think differently. The courage to think differently can be particularly crucial in making women's agency have the power to overturn iniquities that are seen in entrenched practices and social arrangements that are often accepted as part and parcel of an assumed quote-unquote natural order. For example, in China and South Korea, the standard routes to women's empowerment, such as female literacy and female economic independence, in which both Korea and China have made major achievements and which have done much for these countries in removing some of the standard forms of inequality, including gender inequality and particularly survival asymmetry, have not alas been able to stem the tide of natality inequality in the form of sex-specific abortion of girl fetuses, working through that sex determination and abortion. And this has led to initiatives, understandably, in these countries to consciously cultivate the value of having daughters and not just sons. So this has become a political supplement to the educational program, somewhat successfully in Korea, in fact, particularly. In India, too, even as women's increased empowerment has contributed to the reduction of excess female mortality, the tendency to use new technology to abort female fetuses have grown in many parts of the country, and women's education alone has not been able to serve as a strong barrier to this regressive movement. Indeed, there's some evidence that the immediate agency for taking decisions of sex-selective abortions, and so it's reported in a New York Times study that was done by Celia Duggan, is often taken by the mothers themselves. What is crucially important in this context is to go beyond what Justice Leela Seth, who I think is also here, in her wonderful talk at the India International Center entitled "The Girl, Child and Governance" earlier in the month, called Patriarchal Mindset. This raises important issues as to how to interpret the agency of women and its social influence. It is, I would argue, important to see the concept of agency as stretching beyond immediate, quote-unquote, control over decisions. The fuller sense of crucial idea of agency must inter alia involve the freedom to question established values and traditional priorities, and indeed the inclination to do so. Agency freedom must in fact include the freedom to think freely without being severely restrained by pressured conformism and by the ignorance of how the prevailing practices in the rest of the world differ from what can be observed locally. For example, what is particularly critical in remedying the terrible biases in natality discrimination, that is sex-specific abortion, and the prevalence of that kind of abortion, is the role of women's informed and independent agency, independent of traditional values as well, including the power of women to overcome unquestionably the attitudes and inherited values of others in the society. What makes a real difference in dealing with the new and the rather high-tech face of gender disparity is the willingness and ability and the courage to reassess critically the dominance of received and entrenched norms when an anti-female bias in action reflects the hold of traditional masculine values from which mothers themselves are not immune. What is crucial is not just freedom of action, but also freedom of thought. Informed and critical agency is important in combating inequality of every kind, and gender inequality is no exception. I end this lecture with some remarks on social demographic statistics, some social demographic statistics, which do not seem to be easily explainable. And I haven't got an explanation, but I can tell you what the problem is. Leela Seth referred in her lecture, to I referred earlier, to the shocking fact that the ratio of females to males have been going down over time in India. And in fact, the girl-to-boy ratio has fallen further from, I believe, 927 girls per 1,000 boys in 2001 to 914 girls per 1,000 boys down in the most recent census in 2011. And Leela said, rightly points how disturbing a trend this is, and we have to look at that. What I would like to supplement here is to examine the regional distribution of this ratio, which I think has not been studied at all significantly, which is unfortunate. Everywhere in the world, this is a fact we should know. We don't expect 100 girls to 100 boys. More boys are born than girls. This is connected with the fact that women survive better. In fact, it took me some time, because since I was unclear in my mind that it may not be a social influence rather than biological influence, it turns out that actually even in the uterus, even in the womb, male fetuses have higher abortion, spontaneous miscarriage, than male fetuses do. Roughly Both 108 or 109 boys are conceived compared with 100 girls. Or we might do it the other way. 100 boys are conceived compared with about 92 girls. Then by the time the birth comes, it's about 94 or 5 girls by 100 boys. And then, of course, over the life, women do better if they get symmetric care, but of course they don't in many countries. But to the extent that they do, then the ratio reverses itself with the preponderance of women rather than men in a fully long-lived populations. We do not have good birth statistics in India, but we do have the data for the number of boys and girls in each state in India in different age groups, including in the ages between 0 and 5. How do these numbers compare with those in the West? The female-male ratio of the same age group, 0 to 5, I think the Indian is 0 to 6 actually, but it's a small difference, is varied a little in Europe, but in an earlier study I took the German ratio as a cutoff point, 94.8 women to 100 girls to 100 boys. And we can perhaps pick this again as a cutoff point, below which significant anti-female intervention in abortions can be strongly suspected. This dividing line produces a remarkable geographical split in India. The states in the north and the west, led by Punjab, Haryana, Delhi, Gujarat, Maharashtra, where the female-male ratio of children is very substantially below the benchmark German cutoff ratio, with ratios, compared with 94.8 cutoff, as low as 83 in Haryana and 84.6 in Punjab. Other states in what can be called North and the West also have ratios significantly below the dividing line of 94.8 girls per 100 boys, such as Himachal Pradesh, by the way, a state with high education, which has caught up with Kerala, indicating that education alone is not going to do it. Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand and Jammu and Kashmir, and marginally Bihar and Jharkhand, but not Chhattisgarh. On the other side of the divide, the states in the east and south of India tend to have female-male ratios that are at or above the German benchmark. That is 94.8 girls per 100 boys, with Assam and West Bengal, to Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, all falling in that category, and sometimes quite substantially, comfortably there. There are small exceptions to this dividing rule. There was none in the 2001 census. 2011, there are small exceptions. Orissa has a ratio, which is though in the east, has a ratio below the cutoff level, but not very much below, and very marginally the northeastern states and Karnataka fall below the German cutoff ratio. Can I offer a powerful explanation of the difference? I fear I cannot. Indeed, roughly the same division was true, as I said, for earlier census, 2001 as well, but not still earlier, because sex-specific abortion couldn't start without the knowledge of sex determination. So we have only these two censuses to look at. I'm struck by the fact, and this is, and about the 2001, where the east-south on one side, north-west on the other side was as sharp, and perhaps marginally sharper. I wrote an article in the British Medical Journal in 2003 December, trying to draw attention to it, and we also put it in our joint book with Jean Duez, my joint book with Jean Duez, Development and Cooperation, published in 2002. I didn't manage to get much attention from anyone at all, including, if I may slightly complain, from Jean Drèze. but it is a very important division, and 2011 reconfirms that picture. What's going on? I'm struck by the fact that this division within the country, which is very different from the classical distinction, which is anthropologically much discussed, between the North and the South, on which people like Iravati Karve have written so convincingly. But this is not the same division. And I'm surprised that this has received so little attention, despite the statistical dichotomy that we can see both in 2001 and 2011 censuses. By the way, I should say Bangladesh, again, is solidly no deficit at all. In fact, it seems like a surplus of girls compared with a ratio coming quite much higher than much higher than the German ratio. Better survival for girls, and I mean this is 0 to 6. So I think even if the ratio were the same as Germany at birth, by the time 6 years have gone, the Bangladeshi girls, because of lower mortality rate than Bangladeshi boys, would be ahead, and that's what you do see. So that fits into the division of the subcontinent into east and south on one side and north and west on the other. To explain the origin and continuation of this division, we have to look far beyond the usual statistics and go more into history and culture of each region. So the subject on which I have been talking generates, I fear, more questions than answers. Am I discouraged by this? I have to confess I am not, because I believe we shall never get to the answers unless we start asking the right questions. Thank you.
So we will be asking a lot of questions. I'm sure we've got 20 minutes. Professor Sen has agreed to answer questions. May I request for hands, a show of hands, so that I can... Dr. Mittal.
Good evening, everybody. I am Sunita Mittal. I am Professor and Head of Obstetrics and Gynecology at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, responsible for looking after women's health. And I really thank Professor Amrita Sen for a highly illuminating oration on women and other people. And I'm also glad that you touched on the issue of sex ratio and sex-selective abortion. My question to you is, do you have any strong social or economic solution to female feticide, which is rampant across the country, barring very few pockets which you mentioned, because primarily the PCP Anti-Day Act is only based on medical technology and it has largely failed to control the menace. So do we have anything else which we could do? Yeah.
I think the economic explanation of eliminating that bias, which quote-unquote Gary Becker made very famous, actually fails their statistical text fairly comprehensively across the world, which I think Caldwell pointed out, and within India, which Drèze Murthy, Guyo's work also bring up, and later follow-up work of Drèze and Murthy. The idea that the gender inequality may go away with education and women's empowerment seemed to work as far as the mortality difference is concerned, but it didn't seem to get away because of the things that I discussed towards the end of the paper. And I think what Leela said calls the patriarchal mindset is a very extraordinarily important thing. Now, it's not clear to me why it should be less strong in West Bengal and Assam and in the south than it would be in the west in the west or the north. But I think we have to see, that's the picture that I have to look at. And I think I really mean what I said. I don't know the answer, but I'd like to know the answer. And I think most inquiries of this kind begin without our knowing the answer. So I'm very encouraged, I have to tell you, by your support on the importance of this question. And I'm a little frustrated because I've been writing, as I mentioned, from 2002 and 3 in journals like British Medical Journal. Pretty much people don't read it. So I don't know, but it has been a decade. And one of the things statisticians like doing is one thing to explain past fact, but if you make a prediction based on that, and you find it confirmed the next observation, then you have some greater confidence in that. That's exactly what happened in the 2011 statistic. The fact that when the statistics were kept coming out, I was in America, as it happened at Harvard, I was struck by the fact not a single comment came on the regional difference. They were all about the average going down and such issues. So I think it is a neglected thing, and since, thanks to the chair and Poolam, I got an audience. I thought I would try out and see whether this works. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Shailendra Mehta from the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. So, Amartya, this is a question about labor force participation rates on the part of women, which, as you correctly indicated, is a very important marker of empowerment. Now, not only is the Indian ratio, as you correctly pointed out, much lower than Bangladesh, right, almost half of that, but it's going down in percentage terms, but also even in absolute terms. So from 2004 to 2009, there have been 20 million fewer women in the workforce, as Dr. Rangarajan has pointed out, and that is extremely puzzling. It has not been commented upon, and so I thought this would be the perfect occasion to ask you to do so.
Absolutely right to emphasize that, Shailendra. And I think it is a very important thing to look at. There is a causal question, though. That is it the case that, say, take Bangladesh, which has both less gender bias and higher participation rate in particular? Is it the weakening of what Leela calls patriarchal mindset that allows greater participation? Or is it the greater participation which has contributed to the weakening of the patriarchal mindset? I don't know. I think it's probably not explainable by a single factor thing about participation, because as far as I can see, the Bangladeshis took to the textile and so on very early, and it played a major part in all kinds of ways. There's a paper by Naila Kabir, who is a Bangladeshi in England, contrasting the hold of traditional religious politics among the Bangladeshi Muslim community in England, as opposed to that in Bangladesh itself, where it's weakened very sharply. She related it to the fact that the textile and the women's participation in independent earning was playing a major part. So that's the argument on the outside. You can see. But she also said that's not the only thing that's going on. You have to look at certain aspects of Bengali culture. Bear in mind that even pre-independence, Bangladesh didn't have a religious Muslim League government. There was Fazlul Haq was a Muslim chief minister, but he was leading the Peasants' Party. It's only for a slither of a small number of years when there was a coalition Muslim League government. So I think there were certain differences about thinking about religious division, and also gender division. So I think we have to look at a much bigger picture of cultural contrast in this. So the short answer is I don't know. The long answer is the one I've given you.
Hi, I am Abhijit Visaria. I'm a PhD candidate in demography at the University of Pennsylvania. And a visiting...
Candidate where?
In demography at Penn.
At Penn, yeah.
And a visiting fellow here at PFI this summer. Persisting with this theme that we're talking about, I'm wondering if improved schooling, literacy, employment, and its transformative power is a bit of an oversell when it comes to being able to counter more patriarchal structures that have been persistent for a long while. And the reason why that may be so is because while they're transformative in enabling agency, they don't quite enable critical agency or relative influence vis-a-vis men and these others. And I'm wondering if that relative influence is something that the bargaining model is actually missing.
I'm not sure I got exactly what is it that I'm supposed to be missing.
So relative influence to be able to challenge a greater patriarchal structure. Because in some sense, women may be catching up with men when it comes to schooling, literacy.
Yeah, but the schooling allows you to do it.
Right.
Schooling encourages you to do it, gives you the ability to do it. Is that what you mean?
I'm saying that schooling enables agency, but it doesn't quite enable critical agency or what is relative influence. Influence to be able to overcome a structure, whereas...
Well, I think it's complicated. I try to discuss it because schooling certainly increases your voice. There's no question about that. Of that we have a lot of evidence. And it also increases your knowledge and understanding. And now some people have been very skeptical of the question whether mothers consciously discriminate against girls in terms of nutrition. And nutrition, I too haven't found much evidence. I did find, looking at some hospital admission data done in the early 1980s, that there was, girls were sometimes taken later to hospital than boys in terms of getting medical attention. So maybe more connected with health. I think people, have questioned that, whether that generalization really holds. And I think if you have schooling, educated mothers, it's more likely to see that there's something rather peculiarly wrong about the differential treatment of girls and boys, if that is indeed the case, which may be more seen in healthcare than in nutrition. By the way, the village study that I did many years ago, along with Sen Gupta, didn't indicate nutritional differences, but did indicate health differences, which ultimately, not because of nutritional intake difference, but because of parasitic diseases, had a greater impact on the nutrition of girls and boys differentially. But you see, I think that patriarchal mindset could be challenged both by better understanding and by the willingness to advocate that change in attitude. And here, politics plays a part. There is a guy called Jerry Mackey, who is at San Diego, who studied the movement for the abolition of foot binding in China. And one thing that emerged, there was a kind of consensus on foot binding, which many individuals didn't really believe in, but no one is going to depart from it. So when there was a kind of agitation, and when the number of people, and they were asking, saying, I guarantee I will not foot bind my daughter, when it reached a proportion of 30, 40%, it had a kind of tipping point, and suddenly it went to 70, 80, 90%. And we saw the same thing in Senegal recently about genital mutilation. And that was again studied partly by Jerry Mackey, but partly by an organization called Tustan, which were looking at NGO, which was looking into it. So I think there comes a number of things in this. And in that case, the question you have to ask, does education help such political organization or not? It might. So I think the answer is not going to be a very simple answer. There will be many factors involved. Schooling, its impact on your own thinking, your understanding, your voice, and your ability to participate with others in stopping what you yourself may not want. And I think that's what I think Ala Kabasu had been also arguing that in a different context. And it could be quite a big thing. So it's really a very complicated thing we're looking at. My concern is that the anthropological theories that I've been able to read are a different kind of division when it comes to, than in the fertility differential. Because a north-south division has a kinship-based explanation, which is quite different, a kind of Hindu Sanskritist society as opposed to Southern. And it doesn't seem, there's no division in that respect between, say, Bengal and Assam on one side and Punjab and Haryana. In fact, Bengal and Assam has a higher proportion of Sanskrit words than Punjab and Haryana has. So I don't think it's a Sanskritic Tamilian culture division at all. So there's something complicated, we just don't know. So I would say, answer to your question, do I know whether I'm neglecting something? I don't know. But I'm pretty convinced that I am, because I haven't got an explanation yet.
I wonder if you have some thoughts on what elements of macroeconomic policy one can use to reverse the sex ratio decline in India.
Yeah, that's an easy question for me to answer. I don't believe that you will find. I've tried a few statistical fit. You won't find much. I think the Reserve Bank won't have a great role in this. I think it doesn't have as much of a role in regenerating the Indian allegedly low growth rate, which actually continues to find peculiar that the country is not ashamed of having more undernourished kids, even not only absolutely but also proportionately, but worried that the growth rate has fallen to 6.3 or 6.5 is the latest estimate I think I saw year on year, not the last quarter. On the other hand, I also saw not only Europe congratulating itself, the Eurozone at zero growth rate, that as opposed to falling earlier, and now it's come to a congratulatory level of zero growth rate. And this morning I saw that Sweden, I think I saw it in the Mint, has now exemplary growth rate, namely 2.3%. So I think we have to worry about things that really are worrying. And unfortunately, but I'm in favor of growth rate being raised because it generates public revenue. But on the other hand, I don't think Reserve Bank and macroeconomic policy is not going to do very much for it. And part of the problem, and if you're really interested how harmful banking-oriented thinking might be, I did read a paper in the New York Times some months ago, well, 2 months ago, and one in The Guardian last month. But there is a paper coming out this week, well, actually, day after tomorrow, in the New Republic. It's called What Happened to Europe? And the subtitle is Bankers' Decision and Democracy.
Hi, I'm Kishwar Desai. Hi, Amartya. How are you? I'm an author. I wrote a book called Witness the Night, which is actually about female feticide and infanticide. I wanted to say two things, really. One is, do you think reservations, in this country is always for caste and so on. If there was serious reservation, in jobs and in schools and colleges all across the board for women, do you think that would help as affirmative action? And the other thing is something that you mentioned about how the sex ratio had been falling more dramatically perhaps after all these scans and so on came up. But of course I come from Punjab where there's been female infanticide for a long time. Okay, so I just wanted your comment on that. Yeah.
I think reservation is reservation have many merits and many demerits, and you and I could chat on that at another occasion. On this particular thing, I don't think reservation is going to do much, really. Because if you're trying to change your mindset by delivering it on grounds of reservation, does not do very much for you. The hope is that you would then propagate that perspective being in a position of power. I don't know how far in the case, and in some cases for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, it might have played that role to some extent. Not fully either. I think Andrew Vitae and some others would deny that. But generally, I don't think women's reservation is going to have any great impact on that. That would be my thought. I think the general story is falling from 927 to 9 per thousand to 914. It is a fall, it's a small fall. But if you look at it, there's a kind of tiny change, even in east and south, slight decline, which is why Orissa has just gone to the other side. On the other hand, some others have come on the opposite direction. Tamil Nadu, the girls' ratio got out, was marginally just touching the German line below, and now is comfortably above. I think the north and south, as north and west do have reason to be concerned about that. And it is not something where the solution is best thought of at the all India level. I mean, we know that Bengal and Assam recently, and Bengal for a long time, have problems of their own. There's no denial. But Punjab and Haryana, though very successful in many ways, do have these problems, and these have to be addressed. I think one of the things that's increasingly clear is different regions of India have rather different set of problems. They succeed in some respects and fail in others. And this is the respect in the north and west. Really have to devote even greater energy than... I think this is not a serious problem, I would have thought, in Calcutta. Calcutta has all kinds of peculiar things, like a fertility rate 1.2, which puts it somewhat below that in Italy and Germany. So, you know, the country is very diverse. And so the solution, the nature of the problems differ. There's no region without a problem, but they're not with the same problem.
Sunil Sethi from NDTV, sir. Going back to this skewed sex ratio, you seem to draw this kind of geographic diagonal across the country, north and west, showing worsening indicators compared to the east and south. The odd part is, of course, that in states like Haryana, Punjab, Himachal, where the sex ratio is showing a decline, seem to have much better opportunities for women, both in terms of education and work outside the house. So, I mean, how do you resolve this contradiction? Does it just boil down to what Leela Seth calls the patriarchal mindset? How do these women, more educated, at the workplace, are unable to support their daughters or their choice in having female infants?
I think three things to say on that. One is that I think the economic causation are limited. You know, if you had Becker kind of causation, then of course Punjab and Haryana with its success would have easily swamped these problems, which it hasn't. Kerala, since its income has gone up a lot, looks as if it might have. But then again, it never had that problem to start with. So I think the economic causation there doesn't seem to work so much. And finding employment may not work that much either. I'm not even sure that actually the ratio of women's employment is higher in Punjab and Haryana than it is in the East. Very often the nature of the employment is maybe much higher because the region is much richer. I think, and then again we know that it depends on the type of work. For example, Rajasthan, which has had a high ratio of women employment, but not very high quality, high wage women, have not been able to overcome this problem through this economic means. So I have to say I maintain, Sunil, despite your pointer to what may look like a dilemma. I don't think it is a dilemma, really. I mean, Bangladesh would be the mother of all dilemmas, if you want to look at it. But that way, because the wages are low, its growth rate is lower than India, though not negligible. I mean, way above than Sweden and every country in Europe and America, even higher than Brazil. On the other hand, it's low in Asian standard. But on the other hand, its progress has been absolutely unbelievably dramatic if you look at the numbers, how things have changed. So I don't think I don't end up having a sense that going from the economic change to the causation is going to give you very much. The mindset seems to stand on its own, has some historical roots. I think in the case of Bangladesh, one point that was made to me, and we are still, Jean and I, looking at it. I've been trying to persuade Jean to go to Bangladesh again in between now and the next time we sit down with it. But when I talk with some of the NGOs, and particularly people who were involved in the freedom movement, thought that the role of women in the freedom movement itself played a very big part in changing. There's no question that Bangladesh has started thinking about these issues very differently. including secularism. This is a strong commitment, even though Muslims are 92% of the population. So it shows a level of sophistication in thinking about the demands of a multi-religious society, which in many ways actually exceed, I have to say, not every part of India, but certainly some parts of India.
Radha Kumar, Delhi Policy Group. Back in 1992, the women's movement in Delhi, at any rate, took up the question of declining sex ratio. And I remember this was a sort of pre-election, so we invited all the spokespeople of the major political parties to come and talk to us, and we put forward one set of recommendations to them, which was that in terms of affirmative action, below poverty line families should be offered a stipend for every baby daughter that was born to them, and the stipend should run right through school up to college level. Now, I believe the Tamil Nadu government was one of the few that did adopt a version of that recommendation, and later I was told that 2 or 3 other governments had also, state governments had also taken it up. But I've not seen any statistics on what were the outcomes or results and whether that might have affected a change of the sort that you are describing. My other point is just a comment, really, and also a little bit of a question. I wonder whether correlation of figures of violence against women could help shed some light on reasons for decline. I've certainly found, I would say, quite frankly, that I consider even the term patriarchal to be too mild a term for what is happening in our country today. I think we're becoming a seriously femophobic society.
Well, Radha, thanks very much for these questions. The second is also a question, really. And any comment becomes a question when you say, do you agree? But on the first, I'm very skeptical of the economic incentive of paying people more for producing daughters and so on. That's not the only example, but there could be others. I think in some ways it seemed to attempt to suppress the real question, what they ought to think about. Namely, it's one thing to say that I'll produce a daughter, I will welcome a daughter, I'll get some money for it, rather than we welcome a daughter because it's the good news for the family. So I really am, I may be unrealistic, and maybe that may work. It's a little like what people are advocating a lot now, that if you do well in school and if children get, if teachers produce children who are producing good grades, then teachers get a higher salary. And somehow it seems to me that if it works, one has to accept that it must have some role. And it seems very sad that the teacher's compulsion to teach students should be dependent on how much money you can make out of it, rather than to do the devoted work of a teacher. So I think I'm not generally sympathetic, so I'm rather prejudiced against it. Have I seriously studied whether it's had effect? No, I haven't studied. What little evidence I've seen hasn't encouraged me to change my mind on that. On the other hand, it's very little, and encouraged by you, maybe I'll spend a bit more time to look at it. On the other subject of violence against women, I just don't know. It may well be connected. There's some evidence that these two things go together, mainly of a European kind. I haven't seen any Indian comparative studies between districts and regions at all on that. So that's a good question.